Welcome everyone to Mr. Brandon's new channel. Here is where horror and mystery stories are born. If you're a fan of this content, you're in the right place. In every video, we'll take you on a journey filled with excitement, suspense, and horror. So don't hesitate to subscribe to the channel to receive all new updates. And if you like the content, feel free to hit the like button and leave a comment that motivates us to continue. Now, let's dive into today's stories. As I sit here in the dim light of my apartment, trying to make sense of the horrors that have unfolded over the past few weeks, I can't help but wonder if sharing this story will bring me any semblance of peace. My name is Caleb Robertson, and what I'm about to recount may seem impossible, perhaps even the ramblings of a madman, but I swear on everything I hold dear, every word is true. It all began about 3 weeks ago, when I decided to go camping with 3 of my old high school buddies in the Huntsville National Forest in Texas. We'd been doing this for years, getting together at least once annually to reconnect and escape the pressures of our everyday lives. The group consisted of myself, Ryan Thompson, Zach Miller, and Kevin Porter. We were all in our mid-20s, with the others attending various colleges, while I had opted for a job straight out of high school. Our plan was simple. We'd go backpacking deep into the forest, living off the fish we'd catch and whatever small game we could trap. We'd done similar trips in Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico, so we felt pretty confident in our outdoor skills. This time it was my turn to choose our destination, and I picked Huntsville, or more accurately, Huntsville, New Waverly. The day we set out was perfect. Clear skies, a light breeze, and the promise of adventure hanging in the air. We parked our car at the designated camping spot and began our trek into the forest. The first few hours were filled with laughter and catching up. Ryan regaled us with stories of his latest romantic escapades, while Zach complained about his demanding engineering courses. Kevin, always the quiet one, mostly listened and occasionally chimed in with a witty remark. As dusk began to settle, we decided to make camp. We found a small clearing that seemed perfect. Level ground, a nearby stream, and enough dead wood scattered around to build a decent fire. We set up our tents and gathered firewood, falling into the familiar rhythm of our annual ritual. Once the fire was crackling merrily, we settled in for our favorite camping tradition, trying to scare each other with weird stories. Kevin started off with a tale about a hitchhiker he'd allegedly picked up who disappeared from his car while he was driving. Zach followed with a story about strange lights he'd seen in the desert during a solo camping trip. Ryan, always one for dramatics, launched into a long-winded ghost story that had us rolling our eyes more than shivering in fear. It was around this time that we noticed a faint, peculiar smell in the air. It was barely there, just on the edge of perception, but undeniably odd. We couldn't quite place it, so we shrugged it off and continued our storytelling. As the night wore on, Ryan announced he needed to relieve himself and wandered off into the darkness. We barely paid attention, continuing our conversation around the fire. But when he came running back moments later, his jeans soaked and his face as white as a sheet, we knew something was terribly wrong. Ryan was gasping for breath, his eyes wide with terror. Before any of us could ask what had happened, he was screaming at us to follow him and took off back into the forest. Confused and alarmed, we grabbed our flashlights and ran after him, the warmth and safety of our campfire quickly fading behind us. As we ran, guided only by the frantic bobbing of Ryan's flashlight ahead, we began to hear something that made our blood run cold. A faint scream and crying in the distance coming from the direction we were heading. The forest seemed to close in around us, the darkness between the trees almost palpable. Suddenly, Ryan slowed down, and we nearly crashed into him. In the gloom ahead, we could make out the silhouette of a dilapidated cabin. It looked ancient and abandoned, its windows covered in a thick layer of grime. But from one of those windows, we could see a faint, flickering light. The crying was louder now, clearly coming from inside the cabin. It was a heart-wrenching sound, filled with pain and despair. We approached the front door cautiously, our hearts pounding in our chests. Ryan, still in the lead, raised his hand to knock. The moment his knuckles touched the weathered wood, the crying stopped abruptly. We all held our breath, straining our ears in the sudden silence. Then we heard it. Heavy footsteps inside the cabin, moving quickly towards the door. There was a loud slam against the door that made us all jump, followed by the sound of a bolt being drawn back. And then, nothing. We waited, our nerves stretched to the breaking point, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, Zach suggested we check around the house. None of us wanted to be left alone, so we moved as a group, our flashlights darting nervously from shadow to shadow. At the back of the cabin, we found a window set high in the wall. Kevin, the tallest among us, volunteered to take a look inside. Ryan and I gave him a boost, watching anxiously as he wiped away years of dirt and cobwebs from the glass. Kevin pressed his face against the window, squinting to see inside. For a moment, everything was still. Then, without warning, he sucked in a sharp breath and let out a blood-curdling scream. He fell backward, nearly crushing Ryan and me as we tried to catch him. Kevin was hysterical, thrashing and screaming incoherently. We tried to calm him down, but he was beyond reason. Suddenly, he broke free from our grasp and took off running towards our campsite. Frightened and confused, we chased after him, unwilling to let anyone get separated. When we finally caught up to Kevin at the campsite, he was still in a state of panic. I busied myself rekindling the fire, my hands shaking so badly I could barely strike the matches. Zach and Ryan managed to get Kevin to sit down, but he wouldn't stop screaming and gasping for air. We spent the rest of the night huddled around the fire, jumping at every snapping twig and rustling leaf. Kevin's screams gradually subsided into whimpers, but he remained in a catatonic state, mumbling unintelligibly to himself. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the trees, Ryan and I decided to go back and investigate the cabin in the daylight. We retraced our steps from the night before, but when we reached the spot where the cabin should have been, we found nothing. No cabin, no clearing, not even a foundation or any sign that a structure had ever stood there. What we did find was a smell, the same faint, unidentifiable odor from the night before, but now much stronger. It was a sickly, sweet stench of decay, like something long dead and rotting in the summer heat. Unsettled and confused, we made our way back to the campsite. The scene that greeted us there was horrifying. Kevin had chewed into the sides of his own face, blood dripping down his chin and staining his shirt. He had swallowed so much of his own blood that he was vomiting, his face a mask of pain and terror. Zach looked like he had aged years overnight, his face haggard with exhaustion and fear. Kevin, through his self-inflicted wounds, managed to croak out that we needed to leave immediately. We started packing up our gear as quickly as we could, our hands fumbling with tent poles and sleeping bags. As if to punctuate the urgency of our situation, the sky began to darken ominously, and a heavy rain started to fall. Kevin's panic seemed to escalate with each passing moment. He grabbed a large stick and began threatening us, saying he'd knock us out and drag us from the forest himself if we didn't move faster. The tension finally snapped when Ryan started yelling back at him, and a fight broke out between the two. Zach and I managed to separate them, and we finished packing in tense silence. As we began our trek back to civilization, the rain intensified, turning the forest floor into a treacherous, muddy mess. After what felt like hours of slogging through the downpour, we reached the creek we had crossed on our way in. But the gentle stream we had easily forded just a day before had transformed into a raging torrent, swollen with rainwater and far too dangerous to cross. Kevin's fragile composure shattered completely at this setback. He began screaming at Ryan, blaming him for taking too long to pack up the tent. The argument quickly escalated, with Kevin becoming more and more unhinged by the second. It took all of our combined efforts to calm Kevin down enough to tell us what he had seen in the cabin window the night before. His account sent chills down our spines. According to Kevin, the moment he put his face to the glass, another face appeared on the other side, mimicking his position exactly. The face began to smile, the grin growing wider and wider until it seemed to split the entire face. The eyes and mouth were pitch black, darker than any shadow Kevin had ever seen. Then, Kevin said, a massive shadowy figure appeared behind the face in the window. It raised something, Kevin couldn't tell what, and brought it down in a vicious arc, slicing the smiling face clean off. The severed face remained stuck to the window, its impossible grin still in place as it slowly slid down the glass, accompanied by quiet, chilling laughter. Ryan, despite his earlier anger, was visibly shaken by Kevin's story. We all were. But with the creek blocking our path back to the car, we had no choice but to follow it, hoping to find a safe place to cross. As we walked along the swollen banks of the creek, we began to notice something strange floating in the water. Toys. Not just any toys, but old weathered dolls. Barbie dolls and baby dolls, dozens of them, perhaps even hundreds, all bobbing along in the muddy current. Ryan, curiosity overcoming his fear, reached out and snagged one of the dolls as it floated by. It was a baby doll, its once cheerful face now discolored and warped by time and water. As Ryan turned it over in his hands, we heard a faint gurgling sound coming from within the doll. It was some kind of voice chip, clearly damaged by water but still functioning. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. A child's voice, laughing and then whispering. The sound made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and I could see the others were equally disturbed. Ryan quickly tossed the doll back into the creek, and we continued our journey in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As the day wore on and the sun began to set once more, our nerves became increasingly frayed. Kevin's whimpering grew louder, and we all began to see things moving in the shadows between the trees. At first we dismissed it as tricks of the light or our overwrought imaginations, but as the sightings became more frequent and consistent, we could no longer deny that something was out there, watching us. Just as twilight was fading into true night, we stumbled into a clearing and found ourselves face to face with the impossible. The cabin. The same cabin we had encountered the night before, the same cabin that had vanished without a trace in the morning light. It stood before us now, as real and solid as the ground beneath our feet. Ryan, pushed to the breaking point by fear and frustration, declared that he'd had enough. He announced his intention to enter the cabin and confront whatever was inside, to prove to himself and to us that it was all just a product of our overactive imaginations. We tried to stop him, all of us, even Kevin in his semi-catatonic state. But Ryan was beyond reason. He shrugged off our restraining hands and marched towards the cabin, his face set in grim determination. As Ryan approached the cabin, the forest around us came alive with sound. Hundreds, maybe thousands of voices filled the air, the same gurgling, dying battery sound we had heard from the doll in the creek. But now it was a cacophony of laughter, whispers, and a tonal singing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Overwhelmed by the nightmarish chorus, we pushed past the cabin, half dragging Kevin along with us. The smell of decay grew stronger with each step, filling our nostrils and making us gag. We could hear crying and screaming in the distance, but we pressed on, driven by blind panic and the desperate need to escape this forest that had become a living nightmare. By some miracle, we eventually found a place where we could cross the creek safely. We stumbled out of the woods and back to our car, piling in without a word. The relief of reaching relative safety was palpable, but short-lived. As we drove towards the highway that would take us back to Houston, we found the road blocked by construction. A detour sign pointed us down a small, bumpy dirt road that led back into the woods. We hesitated, the thought of re-entering the forest filling us with dread, but we had no other choice. As we turned onto the dirt road, a figure emerged from the shadows at the roadside. It was a young woman, or at least it appeared to be at first glance. She looked distressed, her face bruised and her movements unsteady, as if she were drugged. The woman approached the passenger side of the car where Kevin was sitting. He didn't roll down the window or unlock the door, his earlier experiences having made him wary of anything and everything in this God-forsaken place. The woman pressed her face against the window, and as she did, her features began to change. Her mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, mirroring the face Kevin had described seeing in the cabin window. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I floored the accelerator, and we sped away, leaving the grinning woman thing behind us. Kevin broke down, crying and screaming, and the rest of us weren't far behind, our nerves finally snapping under the weight of everything we'd experienced. We eventually made it back to the highway and drove straight through to my apartment in Houston. None of us spoke during the journey. There were no words to adequately express what we had been through. When we arrived, we went our separate ways without much discussion. The shared horror of our experience had paradoxically driven a wedge between us, each of us retreating into our own minds to try and process what had happened. In the days that followed, things only got stranger. Mike messaged me saying he was planning to go back to the forest. I tried to talk him out of it, but he was convinced that it had all been in our heads, that he needed to go back to prove to himself that he wasn't afraid. I haven't heard from him since. The stench from the forest seems to have followed me home. I smell it everywhere now, that sickly sweet odor of decay. I've become a virtual hermit, too afraid to leave my apartment or even answer the door. Last week I noticed that everyone I encountered was acting strangely. People I've known for years, complete strangers on the street. They all watched me with an unsettling intensity, their expressions blank and their eyes wrong somehow. I went to my father's house for dinner, hoping that the familiar surroundings and his comforting presence would help settle my nerves, but when I arrived, I found him changed. He sat silently throughout the meal, just watching me with an unblinking stare. When I tried to engage him in conversation, he would only shake his head slowly, never uttering a word. As I was leaving, I turned to wave goodbye and saw that his eyes had turned completely black, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest. When I returned later with the police, there was no sign of my father. The house was empty and looked as if it hadn't been lived in for years. I tried calling Alex, but his family acted as if they'd never heard of him. The police were no help either. Halfway through my report, the line filled with static, and I could hear faint whispers and laughter in the background. Now, as I sit in my apartment, I can feel my grip on reality slipping away. Someone keeps pushing pieces of dismembered dolls through my mail slot. When I try to call anyone, all I hear is static and the sound of dying battery-powered dolls crying and screaming. My television, which hasn't worked in months, suddenly came to life while I was in the bathroom. I could hear it playing, but when I went to check, the screen was dark and silent. The neighbors above me have started screaming in pain, interspersed with the sound of heavy footsteps and things being thrown around. From the apartment next door, I hear what sounds like a baby crying, but the sobs gradually morph into the mechanical wail of a doll with dying batteries. My phone rings incessantly, and when I answer, I hear Alex's voice speaking in a language I've never heard before, a tongue that sounds ancient and wrong in ways I can't begin to describe. And now, as I write this, someone is knocking at my door. The knocks have turned to pounding, and I can hear the bolts unlocking one by one. I've run to the door, frantically relocking each bolt as it mysteriously unlocks itself. My heart is pounding so hard I fear it might burst from my chest. The pounding on the door continues, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. I stumble back to my computer, desperate to finish this account, to leave some record of what's happened in case I don't make it through this night. The pounding has stopped now, replaced by an eerie silence that's somehow even more terrifying. I can hear my own ragged breathing, loud in the stillness of the apartment. Then, a sound that chills me to my very core, the slow, deliberate turning of the doorknob. I hold my breath, watching in horror as the door begins to open, inch by agonizing inch. A fetid odor wafts in, that same sickly sweet stench of decay that's been haunting me since the forest. I want to run, to hide, but my body won't respond. I'm frozen in place, my eyes fixed on the widening gap. A hand appears, gripping the edge of the door. It's pale and bloated, the skin mottled with patches of decay. As the door swings wider, I see a figure standing in the hallway. It's Ryan, or what's left of him. His clothes are tattered and caked with mud, his skin pallid and sagging. But it's his face that truly horrifies me. It's no longer his own. Instead, it's that same impossible grin we saw on the woman by the road, stretching from ear to ear, black eyes gleaming with malevolent glee. "Caleb," it says, in a voice that's both Ryan's and not Ryan's, "we've been waiting for you to come home." I finally find my voice and scream, the sound tearing from my throat. I lunge for the window, my only possible escape route. As I struggle with the latch, I hear more footsteps in the hallway. Glancing back, I see Kevin and Zach joining Ryan, their faces bearing the same grotesque grins. The window finally gives way and I clamber out onto the fire escape. I live on the 3rd floor, and the ground seems impossibly far away, but I have no choice. I can hear them entering my apartment, their whispered laughter carried on the night air. I begin to descend the fire escape as quickly as I can, the metal rattling ominously beneath my feet. I'm 1 floor from the ground when I hear a sound from above. They've followed me out the window. My foot touches the pavement and I take off running, not daring to look back. The streets are deserted, the streetlights casting long shadows that seem to reach for me as I pass. I can hear them behind me, their footsteps echoing off the buildings. I run without direction, driven purely by terror. My lungs burn and my legs ache, but I don't dare stop. I turn down an alley, hoping to lose them, but it's a dead end. I spin around, ready to retrace my steps, but they're there, blocking the entrance to the alley. Ryan, Kevin, and Zach stand shoulder to shoulder, those impossible grins still plastered across their faces. Behind them, I can see more figures emerging from the shadows. My father, Alex's family, the woman from the forest road, all wearing the same horrifying smile. "Why are you running, Caleb?" Ryan asks, his voice a grotesque parody of friendship. "Don't you want to come home?" I press my back against the wall, my mind racing. There's no way out, no escape. As they begin to advance down the alley, I close my eyes, bracing myself for whatever comes next. But the attack I'm expecting doesn't come. Instead, I feel a hand on my shoulder, gentle but firm. My eyes snap open and I find myself staring into the face of an old man I've never seen before. His eyes are kind, his expression grave. "Wake up, son," he says, his voice cutting through the nightmare like a knife. "It's time to wake up." I blink, confused. The old man and the alley fade away, replaced by the sterile white of a hospital room. I'm lying in a bed, tubes and wires connecting me to various machines that beep steadily in the background. A doctor is standing over me, her hand on my shoulder. It takes me a moment to realize that she was the old man in my dream. Hallucination, whatever it was. "Welcome back, Mr. Robertson," she says with a smile. "You gave us quite a scare." As my mind slowly clears, the doctor explains what happened. Our camping trip had gone horribly wrong, but not in the way I remembered. There was no cabin, no dolls in the creek, no grinning monsters. The truth, in some ways, was far more mundane, yet no less tragic. We had indeed gone camping in the Huntsville National Forest, but on our second night there, we'd been caught in a sudden violent storm. A flash flood had swept through our campsite, catching us all off guard. Ryan and Kevin had been carried away by the raging waters. Their bodies were found 2 days later, several miles downstream. Zach and I had managed to cling to a tree, but we'd both been injured. Zach had hit his head on a rock and lost consciousness. He was currently in another room in the ICU, still in critical condition. I had been more fortunate, suffering only a broken arm and some cuts and bruises. But the trauma of the event, combined with a high fever from an infection, had sent my mind spiraling into a complex, terrifying hallucination. I'd been in and out of consciousness for over a week, trapped in the nightmare my brain had constructed to try and make sense of what had happened. As the doctor continues to explain, I feel a wave of grief wash over me. Ryan and Kevin are gone. Really gone. Zach might not make it. The horror of my hallucinations fades in comparison to the stark reality of our loss. But mixed with the grief is a profound sense of relief. The monsters, the cabin, the living dolls, none of it was real. The world hasn't turned into a waking nightmare. My father is fine. Alex's family hasn't forgotten him, and there are no grinning creatures waiting to drag me back to some hellish forest. As I lay in the hospital bed trying to process everything, I realized that the true horror wasn't in the fantastical elements of my hallucination. It was in the very real tragedy that my mind was trying to shield me from. The loss of my friends, the close brush with death, the sheer random cruelty of nature. These were the true terrors that my brain had twisted into monsters and impossible grins. I know that the road ahead will be difficult. There will be funerals to attend, grieving families to console, and my own trauma to work through. But as I watch the sunlight streaming through the hospital window, I feel a glimmer of hope. The nightmare is over. Now it's time to wake up and face the day, and face. The crisp autumn air nipped at my face as I guided my RV along the winding forest road. The trees were a riot of red and gold, their leaves rustling in the breeze, nature's last hurrah before winter set in. I'd been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks, a chance to escape the hustle and bustle of city life and clear my head. As a freelance writer constantly juggling deadlines and battling writer's block, I desperately needed this break. Beside me in the passenger seat, my loyal golden retriever Cooper sat with his head out the window, tongue lolling in the wind. His excitement was contagious, and I found myself grinning as we made our way deeper into the wilderness. The stress of the past few months seemed to melt away with each mile marker we passed. As we approached Lake Laconic, the sun was already dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. The lake itself was a mirror, reflecting the sky's vibrant colors and the silhouettes of the surrounding pines. It was breathtaking, and for a moment I forgot all about my writing woes and looming deadlines. I found a secluded spot to park the RV, about 50 yards from the shoreline. It was perfect. Close enough to the water for easy access, but far enough back to give us some privacy. As I began setting up our campsite, I noticed an old pickup truck parked about 100 yards away, partially hidden by a cluster of trees. The truck looked like it had seen better days. Its once blue paint was now a patchwork of rust and faded color, and the tires seemed to be slowly sinking into the soft earth. It struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off. Probably belonged to some old-timer who used the lake as his private fishing spot. With the RV parked and leveled, I set up my folding chair by the water's edge. Cooper sprawled out beside me, his tail thumping contentedly against the ground. I cracked open a cold beer from the cooler and took a long, satisfying swig. The stress of the city seemed to melt away with each passing moment. As darkness fell, I lit a small campfire and roasted some hot dogs for dinner. Cooper got his share too, of course. The night was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No crickets chirping, no frogs croaking, just the occasional pop and crackle from the fire. It should have been peaceful, but something about the silence made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. After dinner, I decided to take a walk around the area, partly to work off the hot dogs and partly to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I grabbed my flashlight and set off along the lakeshore, with Cooper trotting along beside me. The moon was nearly full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Long shadows stretched across the ground, and the trees on the far side of the lake looked like dark sentinels standing guard. As we walked, I noticed something strange. Fresh footprints in the mud near the water's edge. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the trail. It led away from the lake and towards the old pickup truck I'd noticed earlier. As we got closer, I saw a faint light coming from inside the truck's cab. My heart began to race. Someone was in there. I crept closer, trying to stay quiet. Cooper, sensing my tension, remained silent at my side. When I reached the truck, I peered through the cracked rear window. What I saw made my blood run cold. A man was hunched over in the back seat, surrounded by piles of ratty clothes and empty food cans. He was muttering to himself, his hands moving frantically as if searching for something. In the dim light of a battery-powered lantern, I could see that his clothes were torn and filthy, his hair a matted mess. I backed away slowly, not wanting to alert him to my presence. But as I turned to leave, I heard his mutterings more clearly. The words were still indistinct, but the tone sent shivers down my spine. It was a mix of fear and anger, punctuated by what sounded like quiet sobs. Cooper and I hurried back to the RV. Once inside, I locked the door and pulled down all the shades. My mind was racing. Who was that man? Why was he living in that old truck? Was he dangerous? I turned on the small TV, hoping the noise would drown out my thoughts and calm my nerves. Hours passed, and I found myself drifting off to sleep despite my unease. But just as I was about to succumb to exhaustion, a sound jolted me awake. A soft, hesitant knock on the RV door. My heart leaped into my throat. Cooper was instantly alert, his ears perked and a low growl rumbling in his chest. I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight I kept by the bed. It could serve as a weapon if needed, and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response came, just another knock, more insistent this time. "I said, who's there?" I repeated, louder now. Finally, a voice answered, weak, raspy, barely above a whisper. "Please, help me." I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. Everything in me screamed that this was a bad idea, that I should call the police or simply drive away. But something in that voice, the raw desperation, made me pause. Slowly, I cracked open the door, keeping the chain lock engaged. The man from the truck stood there, looking even more haggard up close. His eyes were wild, darting back and forth as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. "What do you want?" I asked, still not opening the door fully. "Please," he repeated, his voice shaking. "Someone's after me. He's going to kill me. I need help." I weighed my options quickly. We were miles from the nearest town, and cell reception out here was spotty at best. Even if I called the police, it could be hours before they arrived. And if this man was truly in danger... Against my better judgment, I unlatched the chain and opened the door. "Come in," I said, stepping back to let him enter. "But I'm warning you, any funny business and you're out. Got it?" He nodded frantically and stumbled inside. I directed him to sit at the small table while I fetched a bottle of water from the fridge. Cooper positioned himself between me and the stranger, his normally friendly demeanor replaced by watchful caution. "What's your name?" I asked as I handed him the water. He gulped it down before answering. "Martin. My name's Martin." "Okay, Martin. Tell me what's going on. Who's after you?" Martin's hands shook as he set down the empty bottle. "I was hiking through the forest a few days ago when I came across this old cabin. It was raining, so I thought I'd take shelter inside. I thought it was abandoned, but..." He trailed off, his eyes going distant. "But what?" I prompted. "There was someone living there. A man. He wasn't right in the head. When he found me, he went berserk. Started screaming about trespassers and thieves. He had a knife." Martin's hand unconsciously went to his side, and I noticed a dark stain on his shirt that I hadn't seen before. "Jesus," I muttered. "Did you go to the police?" Martin shook his head vehemently. "I tried, but he followed me. He knows these woods better than anyone. Every time I thought I'd lost him, he'd show up again. I've been running for days. When I saw your RV, I thought... I hoped..." Just then, a loud bang resonated through the RV, like something heavy hitting the side. Cooper erupted into furious barking, and I felt my heart skip a beat. "Stay here," I told Martin, grabbing my flashlight and the hunting knife I kept in a kitchen drawer. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The night air was cold, raising goosebumps on my skin. The campfire had died down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to create moving shadows at the edge of my vision. I swept the flashlight beam across the clearing, seeing nothing out of place. I was about to head back inside when a low, menacing voice spoke from the darkness. "Where is he?" I spun around, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, a man, tall and powerfully built. His face was hidden in the shadow of a hood, but I could see the glint of moonlight on the blade of a knife in his hand. "Get out of here!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Leave us alone!" The man took a step forward. "Give me the little rat, and I'll go. Otherwise—" He left the threat hanging in the air. I knew in that moment that there was no reasoning with this man. Whatever had happened between him and Martin, it had pushed him beyond the limits of sanity. I had to protect myself and the terrified man in my RV. I backed towards the door, keeping the flashlight trained on the intruder. Just as my hand found the handle, the man lunged forward with surprising speed. His knife slashed through the air where I had been standing a second before. Instinct took over. I swung the heavy flashlight with all my might, connecting with the side of his head. He staggered back, momentarily stunned. I used that precious moment to dive into the RV, slamming and locking the door behind me. "We need to get out of here now!" I yelled to Martin, who was cowering in the corner. I jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life just as the man outside began pounding on the door, trying to force his way in. I threw the RV into drive and stomped on the gas. We lurched forward, tires spinning in the soft earth before finding purchase. The attackers' enraged shouts faded as we sped away from the campsite, deeper into the forest on the narrow access road. For what felt like hours, we drove through the night. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every bend in the road a potential ambush. Martin sat silently in the passenger seat, jumping at every noise. Cooper paced restlessly in the back, still on high alert. Finally, we emerged from the forest and found ourselves on a main road. I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of a small town in the distance. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, the bright fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the darkness we'd just escaped. "Wait here," I told Martin. I went inside, explained the situation to the startled waitress, and used the phone to call 911. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing. I recounted the whole story to the officers: the footprints by the lake, the man in the truck, the attack at the RV. They took Martin into custody, assuring me they would get him the medical and psychological help he clearly needed. As I watched them drive away, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The ordeal was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly finished. The attacker's face, hidden by that hood, haunted my thoughts. He was still out there somewhere in those dark woods, waiting. I spent the rest of the night in the RV, parked under the bright lights of the diner. Sleep was impossible. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. Cooper stayed by my side, a constant, comforting presence. As the first light of dawn broke through the darkness, I made a decision. I couldn't go back to my normal life, not yet. The shadow of that night loomed too large. I needed time to process, to heal. I packed up the RV, made sure we had enough supplies, and set off down the highway. I had no destination in mind, just a need to keep moving, to put distance between myself and Lake Laconic. The road stretched out before me, a ribbon of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, I could find peace again. But for now, all I could do was keep driving, keep fighting the memories, and hope that somewhere down this long road, I would find the solace I so desperately sought. As the sun rose higher in the sky, painting the world in warm, comforting colors, I allowed myself a small smile. Whatever lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain: this was going to make one hell of a story. The highway stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dense forest. I'd been driving for hours, putting as much distance as possible between us and Lake Laconic. Cooper dozed in the passenger seat, his soft snores a comforting counterpoint to the hum of the RV's engine. My mind kept replaying the events of the past night. The mysterious Martin, the knife-wielding attacker, the frantic escape through the dark woods. It all seemed surreal, like something out of a nightmare, but the lingering fear in my gut told me it was all too real. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I spotted a sign for a rest area ahead. My eyes were heavy from lack of sleep, and my hands were starting to shake from too much coffee and adrenaline. I decided to pull over and try to get some rest. The rest area was nearly empty, just a couple of long-haul truckers catching some sleep in their cabs. I parked the RV in a spot far from the other vehicles, still paranoid about being followed. After taking Cooper for a quick walk, I collapsed onto the small bed in the back of the RV. Sleep came in fits and starts, plagued by nightmares of hooded figures and glinting knives. I woke with a start several times, my heart racing, before finally giving up on rest altogether. Instead, I sat at the small table, my laptop open before me, and began to type. Writing had always been my way of processing things, of making sense of the world. And right now, I needed that more than ever. I started at the beginning, describing the peaceful drive to the lake, the serenity of the setting sun on the water. Then I delved into the events of the night, my fingers flying over the keys as I poured out every detail I could remember. Hours passed as I wrote, the words flowing faster than they had in months. It was cathartic, turning the terrifying experience into something I could control, something I could shape. By the time I finished, the sun was setting again, casting long shadows across the rest area. I saved the document and closed my laptop, feeling drained but somehow lighter. The fear was still there, but it no longer seemed all-consuming. I had taken the first step towards reclaiming my narrative. As night fell, I decided to stay put in the rest area. The thought of driving through the dark forest roads again made my palms sweat. I double-checked all the locks on the RV and settled in for another restless night. The next morning I woke early, determined to make some progress. I needed answers, some way to make sense of what had happened. After a quick breakfast and a walk for Cooper, I pulled out my phone and started searching for information about Lake Laconic and the surrounding area. Most of what I found was standard tourist information, camping spots, fishing guides, hiking trails. But buried in a local news site, I found something that made my blood run cold. A series of disappearances in the area over the past few years, hikers and campers who had vanished without a trace. The most recent case was from just 2 months ago. A young couple on a weekend camping trip had failed to return home. Their car was found at a trailhead near the lake, but extensive searches had turned up nothing. The article mentioned unconfirmed reports of a strange figure seen in the woods, but dismissed them as local superstition. My hands were shaking as I set down the phone. Was this connected to what we had experienced? Had Martin stumbled upon something far more sinister than a single deranged man in the woods? I knew I should leave it alone, drive away and never look back. But the writer in me, the part that always needed to know the whole story, wouldn't let it go. I had to know more. With a mixture of determination and dread, I started the RV and pulled back onto the highway. But this time, I wasn't driving away from Lake Laconic. I was heading back to the dark woods and the secrets they held. As I drove, I tried to formulate a plan. I couldn't just wander into the forest hoping to stumble upon answers. I needed to be smart, cautious. I decided my first stop would be the local police station. Maybe they could give me more information about the disappearances, or at least tell me if they'd made any progress with Martin's case. It was mid-afternoon by the time I reached the small town nearest to Lake Laconic. Pinewood was barely more than a main street with a handful of shops, a diner, and the promised police station. I parked the RV in front of the station, gave Cooper a reassuring pat, and headed inside. The station was small, just a front desk and a couple of offices visible behind it. A middle-aged officer looked up as I entered, his expression a mixture of boredom and curiosity. "Can I help you?" he asked, setting aside the paperwork he'd been working on. I took a deep breath and approached the desk. "I hope so. My name is David, and I was camping at Lake Laconic a couple of nights ago. Something happened, and I'm trying to make sense of it." The officer's eyebrows rose slightly. "You wouldn't happen to be the fellow who brought in that injured man, would you? Martin, I think his name was?" I nodded, relieved that at least part of my story was already known. "That's right. I was hoping you could tell me if there's been any progress on his case. And I found some information online about other disappearances in the area. I was wondering if they might be connected." The officer, his nameplate read Jenkins, leaned back in his chair, his expression growing serious. "Why don't you step into my office, David? I think we need to have a talk." As I followed Officer Jenkins into his small, cluttered office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to step into something much bigger and potentially much more dangerous than I had anticipated. But there was no turning back now. I had to know the truth, no matter where it led. I entered Officer Jenkins' office, a small room cluttered with files and papers. He gestured for me to sit in a chair in front of his desk, then closed the door behind us. "All right, David," Jenkins began, settling into his chair behind the desk. "Let me fill you in on what we know so far. Martin's story checks out, at least partially. We found the cabin he mentioned, and there were signs of a struggle, but whoever was living there had cleared out by the time we arrived." I leaned forward, my heart racing. "And the man who attacked us at the campsite?" Jenkins shook his head. "No sign of him. We've increased patrols in the area, but the forest is vast. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack." I hesitated, then asked, "What about the other disappearances, the ones I read about online?" The officer's face grew serious. "We've had our share of missing persons cases over the years. It's not uncommon in areas like this. Hikers get lost, accidents happen. But I'll admit the frequency has been concerning." He pulled out a map of the area and spread it on the desk. Red pins dotted the forest around Lake Laconic. Each of these marks a disappearance or a reported strange sighting over the past 5 years. As you can see, they're concentrated in this region. I studied the map, a chill running down my spine. "That's where I was camping, where I found Martin." Jenkins nodded grimly. "Exactly. We've been investigating, but we're a small department with limited resources. And to be frank, we're out of our depth here." "What do you mean?" I asked. The officer sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Some of the things we've found, they don't make sense. Strange tracks, shelters that couldn't have been built by any animal we know of. And the witnesses who've come back, well, their stories don't always add up." I thought of Martin, his wild eyes and incoherent ramblings. "Like Martin?" "Like Martin," Jenkins confirmed. "We've had people turn up days or weeks after going missing, with no memory of where they've been. Others swear they've seen things in the woods that can't possibly exist. Most folks write it off as trauma or exposure, but—" He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. I finished the thought for him. "But you're not so sure." Jenkins leaned back in his chair, fixing me with a steady gaze. "I've been an officer in this town for 20 years, David. I know these woods, and I know the people here. Something's changed in the past few years. Something's out there, and it's not natural." I felt a mix of fear and excitement coursing through me. This was bigger than I'd imagined, a real mystery unfolding right before my eyes. The writer in me was already spinning possible narratives, but the rational part of my brain was screaming warnings. "What can I do?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "Do? Son, the best thing you can do is get in your RV and drive far away from here. Forget about Lake Laconic and everything that happened. Trust me, you don't want to get mixed up in this." But even as he said it, I knew I couldn't just walk away. I'd come this far, and the story, whatever it was, had its hooks in me now. I appreciate the advice, officer, I said slowly. But I can't just leave. Not knowing what I know now, there must be some way I can help with the investigation. Jenkins studied me for a long moment, then sighed heavily. I can't officially involve you in any capacity, but if you're determined to stick around, there might be something you can do. He pulled out a business card from his desk drawer and scribbled a name and address on the back. There's a woman who lives on the outskirts of town, Mary Hawkins. She's been here longer than anyone, and she knows these woods better than most. If anyone has insights into what's going on, it's her. I took the card, examining the hastily written details. And you think she'll talk to me? Jenkins shrugged. Can't say for sure. Mary's particular about who she opens up to, but she might be more willing to talk to an outsider than to us. We haven't exactly seen eye to eye over the years. I pocketed the card, a new sense of purpose filling me. Thank you, Officer Jenkins. I'll see what I can find out. As I stood to leave, Jenkins called out, David! I turned back to face him. Be careful out there. Whatever's going on, it's dangerous. Don't take any unnecessary risks. I nodded, the gravity of the situation settling over me once more. I'll be careful, I promised. As I left the police station and headed back to my RV, my mind was racing. What had I gotten myself into? And more importantly, what would I find when I dug deeper into the mysteries of Lake Laconic? With a mix of anticipation and trepidation, I started the RV and set off towards the address Jenkins had given me. Whatever secrets Mary Hawkins held, I was determined to uncover them. As I drove through the winding roads leading to Mary Hawkins' house, the forest seemed to press in on all sides. The trees were older here, their gnarled branches reaching out over the road like grasping fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I found Mary's house at the end of a long, overgrown driveway. It was an old craftsman-style home, its paint peeling and shutters hanging askew. The yard was a tangle of wildflowers and tall grass, with a few ancient-looking garden gnomes peeking out here and there. As I stepped out of the RV, the front door creaked open. A small, wiry woman with a shock of white hair emerged onto the porch. Her eyes, sharp and clear despite her apparent age, fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to shrink back into the RV. "You're the writer," she called out. It wasn't a question. I approached cautiously, surprised by her statement. "Yes, ma'am. My name is David. Officer Jenkins suggested I speak with you about—" "I know why you're here," she cut me off, her voice gruff but not unkind. "Come inside. It's not safe to talk out in the open." Bewildered but intrigued, I followed her into the house. The interior was cluttered but clean, every surface covered with books, dried herbs, and curious little trinkets. Mary led me to a small sitting room and gestured for me to take a seat in an overstuffed armchair. "Tea?" she asked, already moving towards what I assumed was the kitchen. "Yes, please," I replied, still trying to get my bearings. She returned a few minutes later with 2 steaming mugs. As she handed me one, I caught a whiff of something earthy and slightly sweet. Not any tea I was familiar with. "It's a special blend," Mary said, noticing my hesitation. "Good for clarity of mind. You'll need it for what we're about to discuss." I took a cautious sip. It was surprisingly pleasant, with a warmth that seemed to spread through my entire body. "Now," Mary said, settling into her own chair, "tell me everything that happened at the lake." So I did. I recounted the events of that night, from finding Martin to our narrow escape from the hooded attacker. Mary listened intently, her eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, she sat back with a heavy sigh. "It's getting bolder," she murmured almost to herself. "What is?" I asked, leaning forward. Mary's gaze snapped back to me. "The thing in the woods, the thing that's been taking people." A chill ran down my spine. "You know what it is?" She shook her head. "Not exactly, but I've been watching these woods for longer than you've been alive, young man. I've seen things that don't belong in this world." I felt a mixture of excitement and fear coursing through me. This was it, the story I'd been searching for. But as I opened my mouth to ask more questions, Mary held up a hand to silence me. "Before we go any further, you need to understand something," she said, her voice deadly serious. "This isn't some mystery novel where the plucky hero solves the case and everyone lives happily ever after. People have died, David. Good people. And if you keep digging, you might join them." I swallowed hard, but my resolve didn't waver. "I understand the risks, Mrs. Hawkins, but I can't just walk away. Not now." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "No, I don't suppose you can." "Very well. I'll tell you what I know, but you must promise me something." "Anything," I said eagerly. "When the time comes, and it will come, you'll do exactly as I say. No questions, no hesitation. Can you promise me that?" The gravity in her voice gave me pause, but I nodded. "I promise." Mary seemed to deflate slightly, as if a great weight had settled on her shoulders. "All right then. Let's begin at the beginning." For the next several hours, Mary wove a tale that seemed more suited to a horror novel than real life. She spoke of ancient Native American legends about a dark spirit that lived in the depths of the forest, of early settlers who vanished without a trace, of strange sightings and inexplicable events stretching back centuries. "But it was always just stories," she said, refilling our teacups. "Things to scare children into staying close to home, until about 5 years ago." "What changed?" I asked, completely engrossed in her narrative. "There was a storm," Mary replied. "The worst I've ever seen. Lightning struck an old oak tree deep in the forest, a tree that had stood for hundreds of years. When it fell, it split the earth beneath it." She paused, her eyes distant. "Something woke up that night. Something old, something hungry." I felt a shiver run through me, despite the warm tea in my hands. "And you think this thing is responsible for the disappearances?" Mary nodded grimly. "I do. And I think it's getting stronger. Each person it takes, each life it consumes, feeds its power." "But what is it?" I pressed. "Some kind of animal? A person?" "Neither," Mary said. "And both. It can take many forms, but its true nature is something else. Something not of this world." I sat back, my mind reeling. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as the ramblings of an old woman with an overactive imagination. But I couldn't shake the memory of that night at the lake, the unnatural silence, the hooded figure that moved with inhuman speed. "What can we do?" I asked finally. Mary's expression turned grim. "Do? There's nothing we can do except try to warn people away, keep them safe. But there has to be a way to stop it," I insisted. "To kill it or banish it or whatever." She shook her head. "Many have tried over the years. None have succeeded." I opened my mouth to argue further, but a sudden noise from outside made us both freeze. It was a low, rumbling sound, almost like a growl, but deeper, more wrong somehow. Mary was on her feet in an instant, moving with a speed that belied her age. "It's here," she hissed. "We've talked too long, drawn its attention." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear over the rush of blood in my ears. "What do we do?" "We run," Mary said, already moving towards the back of the house. "Now!" I followed her through a narrow hallway and out a back door. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and damp. Mary was already halfway across her overgrown backyard, heading for a small shed. As I raced after her, I heard it again, that awful rumbling growl. Closer now, too close. I didn't dare look back. Mary reached the shed and yanked the door open. "Inside!" she barked. "Quickly!" I dove in after her, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The interior of the shed was pitch black and smelled of damp earth and rusted metal. I heard Mary fumbling with something, and then a soft light filled the space. She held an old oil lantern, its flame flickering weakly. In its light I could see that we weren't in a normal shed at all. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the floor was gone. replaced by a set of rough-hewn stone steps leading down into darkness. "What is this place?" I whispered. "Our only chance," Mary replied grimly. She thrust the lantern into my hands. "Take this. Go down the steps. Don't stop. Don't look back. No matter what you hear, keep moving." "What about you?" I asked, even as I moved towards the stairs. Mary's face was set in grim determination. "I'll hold it off as long as I can. Give you time to escape." "But no buts," she snapped. "You promised to do as I said. Now go." With one last look at the old woman who had become my unlikely ally, I started down the steps. The darkness seemed to swallow me whole, the lantern's feeble light barely illuminating a few feet ahead. The stone steps seemed to go on forever, spiraling down into the earth. The air grew colder and damper with each step, and the walls narrowed until I could almost touch both sides at once. The lantern's flickering light cast grotesque shadows on the rough stone walls, making me jump at every perceived movement. Above me I could hear muffled sounds of struggle, crashes, inhuman growls, and worst of all, Mary's voice raised in what sounded like a chant in a language I didn't recognize. I wanted to turn back, to help her, but her words echoed in my mind. "Don't stop, don't look back. No matter what you hear, keep moving." So I pressed on, my free hand trailing along the damp wall for balance. The steps were uneven and slick with moisture, forcing me to move slowly despite my growing panic. I lost all sense of time in that dark descent, my world narrowing to the small circle of light from the lantern and the endless downward spiral of steps. Just as I was beginning to wonder if the stairs would ever end, my foot met level ground. I stumbled slightly, caught off guard by the sudden change. Raising the lantern higher, I found myself in a small circular chamber. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols I'd seen in Mary's shed, and directly across from me was a heavy wooden door. I approached it cautiously, my hand trembling as I reached for the iron handle. It was ice cold to the touch, and for a moment I hesitated. What lay beyond this door? Was I walking into even greater danger? But a thunderous crash from far above made the decision for me. Whatever was happening up there, I couldn't go back. Taking a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. A rush of fresh, cool air hit me, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. I blinked in surprise as I stepped through the doorway, finding myself not in another underground chamber, but in a forest clearing. The full moon hung low in the sky, bathing everything in an eerie silver light. Tall pines surrounded the clearing, their branches swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. And in the center of the clearing stood a massive oak tree, its trunk easily wider than my RV. As I approached the oak, I noticed something odd. Despite its enormous size, the tree looked wrong somehow. Its bark was too smooth, its leaves too dark. And there was something about the way it loomed over the clearing that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I was so focused on the tree that I almost missed the figure standing in its shadow. My heart leapt into my throat as I raised the lantern, only to sag with relief when I recognized Mary. "Mrs. Hawkins," I called out, hurrying towards her. "Thank God you're all right. I thought—" But as I got closer, the words died in my throat. Mary stood unnaturally still, her back to me, and there was something off about her silhouette. "Mrs. Hawkins?" I said again, more hesitantly this time. Slowly, so slowly, she turned to face me. In the lantern light, I could see that her eyes were wide and glassy, her face slack, and protruding from her chest was a thick root-like tendril that led back to the massive oak tree. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling in horror. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. But then Mary's mouth opened, and when she spoke, it wasn't her voice that came out. It was deeper, older, with a sound like rustling leaves and cracking wood. "Welcome, David," the thing wearing Mary's face said. "We've been waiting for you." I wanted to run, to scream, to wake up from this nightmare. but I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the terrifying scene before me. "What? What are you?" I managed to choke out. The thing smiled, using Mary's face in a way that was utterly wrong. "We are the forest," it said. "We are the hunger in the dark, the whisper in the trees. We are what your kind has forgotten and what you will soon remember." As it spoke, more tendrils snaked out from the massive oak, writhing across the ground towards me. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't respond. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, desperately trying to buy time, to think of a way out of this impossible situation. "To survive," the creature said simply. "Your kind has forgotten the old ways, forgotten to feed us, to worship us. So we must take what we need." The tendrils were at my feet now, slowly coiling around my ankles. I could feel their unnatural warmth through my jeans, a sensation that was both revolting and terrifyingly alluring. "Please," I begged, not even sure what I was asking for. "Please don't do this." The thing wearing Mary's face tilted its head, an almost curious expression crossing its features. "You are different," it said. "You seek the truth. You want to understand." "Yes," I said quickly, latching onto this potential lifeline. "Yes, I want to understand. I'm a writer. I can tell your story. Let people know about you." For a long moment, the creature was silent, its stolen eyes boring into mine. Then, slowly, it nodded. "Perhaps," it said, "there is another way, a way for both of us to get what we want." The tendrils around my ankles loosened slightly, but didn't retreat entirely. "What do you mean?" I asked cautiously. "A bargain," the creature said. "Your life, your freedom, in exchange for spreading our story, for bringing us new worshippers." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Was this really happening? Was I actually negotiating with some ancient, monstrous entity in the middle of a haunted forest? "And if I refuse?" I asked, already knowing the answer. The thing smiled again, a terrible sight. "Then you join the others. Part of us. Forever." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. I thought of all the people who had disappeared, of Martin's terror, of Mary's sacrifice, and I knew what I had to do. "I accept," I said, opening my eyes to meet the creature's gaze. The tendrils retreated entirely, slithering back to the massive oak. The thing wearing Mary's face nodded once, then spoke again in that inhuman voice. "Remember your promise, David. Spread our story. Bring us followers, or we will find you wherever you go." And then, between one blink and the next, both Mary and the massive oak were gone. I found myself standing alone in an ordinary forest clearing, the full moon overhead my only witness to the incredible events that had just transpired. I made my way back to my RV in a daze, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened. As I started the engine and pulled away from Mary's house, I knew my life would never be the same. I had a story to tell now, a promise to keep to a force I didn't fully understand. But as I drove through the night, putting distance between myself and Lake Laconic, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The horrors of the lake, the ancient hunger in the forest, they were a part of me now. And somewhere out there in the darkness, I knew they were watching, waiting to see if I would keep my end of the bargain. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I made a silent vow. I would tell their story, yes, but on my terms. I would warn people, try to keep them safe, and maybe, just maybe, I would find a way to end this nightmare once and for all. But for now, all I could do was drive, the weight of my promise heavy on my shoulders, and the shadows of Lake Laconic forever lurking in my rearview mirror. The oppressive Mississippi heat clung to my skin as I sat on my cousin Jake's porch, sipping sweet tea and listening to the cicadas' endless drone. It had been years since we'd seen each other, our lives taking different paths after high school. While I'd pursued a career in journalism, Jake had enlisted in the Mississippi National Guard, becoming a combat medic. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jake's demeanor changed. He set down his glass and leaned forward, his eyes darting around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something happened during our last training exercise. Something I can't explain." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Jake had always been the pragmatic one, not given to flights of fancy or wild tales. Whatever had happened, it must have been significant to shake him like this. "Go on," I encouraged, reaching for my notepad out of habit. Jake took a deep breath and began his story. It had started as a routine training operation, he explained. 2 war platoons per company, 2 companies per team. Jake's group, Camp A, had set up northwest of Yellow Creek. The opposing force had established their position just south of a farm off Waynesboro's Shibuda, east of Waller's Ridge Road. "It was supposed to be a simple exercise," Jake said, shaking his head. "A mock battle to test our tactics and readiness, but it turned into something else entirely." The exercise had begun at midnight. Jake's platoon commander, Lieutenant Wilson, had decided to send out a reconnaissance group to scout for potential ambush positions and gather intelligence on the enemy's movements. Jake's squad had been chosen for the task. "We set out north, following some dirt trails," Jake continued. "We kept to the sides, though, in case we ran into an enemy patrol. By about 2:30 a.m., we were roughly 500 meters from the enemy camp." Jake's squad had found themselves skirting a marsh, which put them in clear sight of a power line cut through the woods. It was then that things took a turn for the bizarre. "Our marksman, Private Hernandez, pulled out his binoculars to check if the way was clear," Jake said, his voice dropping even lower. "One second he was fine, the next he went white as a sheet and just froze." Sergeant Reeves had quickly pulled Hernandez back to the tree line, demanding to know what he'd seen. The young private had stammered something about seeing something down the line that ain't human. Jake leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I've seen men scared before," he said. "Hell, I've been scared plenty of times myself. But the look on Hernandez's face, that was pure terror." Curiosity had gotten the better of the squad, and several others had decided to take a look for themselves. What they saw defied explanation. They described it as this thing, Jake said, his eyes distant as if reliving the moment. 7, maybe 8 feet tall, covered in matted white or gray fur with what looked like dried blood all over its chest. The creature's hind legs, Jake explained, were grotesquely deformed. Incredibly long and slender, with knees that bent backwards, it had been standing out in the open, sniffing the air as if tracking something. Sergeant Reeves radioed the sighting into Company HQ, Jake continued. The response was immediate. "Get the hell out of there. Keep your heads down and keep off the roads. Get some live rounds and weapons free. The game is off." The squad had quickly retreated, but not before Hernandez, having regained some composure, checked again through his rifle scope. Jake's expression grew troubled as he recounted their return to Company HQ. "It was chaos," he said. Mounted patrol vehicles were storming around the camp. Spotlights swept the tree line. The comms were going crazy with reports of sightings in the woods. Another platoon had to be called in to secure the area. Jake fell silent for a moment, lost in thought. I waited patiently, sensing there was more to the story. "The brass shut everything down after that," he finally continued. "No more training exercises for the rest of the month. We were given an official order to keep quiet about what happened. Don't tell anyone," they said, "not even family." I nodded slowly, processing the information. "But you're telling me," I pointed out. Jake met my eyes, his expression a mix of defiance and desperation. "I had to tell someone," he said. "This, whatever it was, it's not something I can just forget about, and I think people need to know." I understood his position. As a journalist, I'd encountered my fair share of cover-ups and suppressed information, but this was different. This was personal. "What do you think it was?" I asked carefully. Jake shook his head. "I don't know for sure, but some of the guys, they started talking about legends, old stories. They called it a skinwalker. I'd heard of skinwalkers before, shape-shifting creatures from Native American folklore. But those were just stories, myths passed down through generations, weren't they?" As the night deepened around us, Jake continued to share more details about the incident and its aftermath. The way the military had swooped in to contain the situation, the hushed conversations among the soldiers, the nightmares that had plagued many of them since that night. I found myself drawn deeper into the mystery, my journalistic instincts kicking into high gear. There was a story here, one that needed to be told. But I also knew the risks involved in pursuing it. The military didn't take kindly to leaked information, especially when it involved something as potentially explosive as this. Over the next few days, I stayed with Jake, using the time to gather as much information as I could. We pored over maps of the area, marking the locations Jake remembered from that night. I researched local legends and historical accounts, looking for any mention of similar creatures or sightings. As I delved deeper into the investigation, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. More than once I caught glimpses of unfamiliar vehicles parked down the street, only to see them speed away when I tried to get a closer look. Jake grew increasingly nervous as the days passed. "Maybe we should just let this go," he said one evening, his voice tight with anxiety. "What if they find out I talked?" I understood his fear, but I couldn't let go of the story. It was too important, too potentially groundbreaking. "We'll be careful," I assured him. "No names, no specifics that could be traced back to you. But people need to know about this, Jake. If there's something out there..." He nodded reluctantly, and we continued our work. A week into my stay, I decided to visit the area where the sighting had occurred. Jake refused to go back, so I set out alone, armed with a camera, a voice recorder, and a growing sense of unease. The woods were thick and oppressive, the humidity making it difficult to breathe. As I followed the path Jake had described, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I reached the power line cut just as the sun was beginning to set. The clearing stretched out before me, a long, narrow gap in the dense forest. I could see why it would have provided a clear line of sight for Jake's squad. As I stood there taking photos and recording my observations, a sudden silence fell over the woods. The constant background noise of insects and birds simply stopped. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the distinct impression that I was no longer alone. Slowly I turned, scanning the tree line. At first I saw nothing out of the ordinary. But then, just at the edge of my vision, something moved. It was tall, far taller than any person I'd ever seen, and it was watching me. For a moment we stood frozen, regarding each other across the clearing. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for its size, it was gone, vanishing into the shadows of the forest. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, crashing through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached my car, slamming the door shut and locking it with trembling hands. As I sat there trying to catch my breath, I realized that my camera was gone. It must have fallen during my panicked flight through the woods, but the voice recorder was still in my pocket, and when I played it back later, beneath my heavy breathing and the sound of snapping twigs, there was something else, a low guttural growl that made my blood run cold. I returned to Jake's house, shaken but more determined than ever to uncover the truth. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the investigation, reaching out to contacts, digging through old records, and piecing together a pattern of similar sightings and encounters stretching back decades. But as I got closer to the truth, the pressure to back off intensified. Anonymous phone calls warned me to drop the story. My apartment was broken into, though nothing was taken. It became clear that someone or something didn't want this information to come to light. Jake, too, was feeling the heat. He called me one night, his voice tight with fear. "They know," he said. "They know I talked. I'm being reassigned, sent to a base halfway across the country. I think it's to keep me quiet." I tried to reassure him, but I could hear the resignation in his voice. He was pulling away, distancing himself from the story and from me. I couldn't blame him. He had a career, a life to protect. But I couldn't let it go. Not now, not when I was so close. As the weeks turned into months, my investigation took me down increasingly dark paths. I uncovered reports of missing persons in the area stretching back years, many of them officially unsolved. I spoke with locals who shared stories passed down through generations, tales of creatures that walked like men but weren't men, of things that lurked in the deepest parts of the forest. But hard evidence remained elusive. Every time I thought I was close to a breakthrough, my leads would dry up. Sources would suddenly become unavailable. Data would mysteriously disappear from public records. It was clear that I was up against something bigger than I had initially realized. This wasn't just about one sighting in the woods. It was about a long-standing cover-up, a concerted effort to keep something hidden from the public eye. As I sit here now putting the finishing touches on this account, I'm acutely aware of the risks involved in sharing this information. But I believe it's important that the truth, or at least as much of it as I've been able to uncover, be known. I don't know what Jake and his squad saw that night in the Mississippi woods. I don't know what I glimpsed in that clearing. But I do know that there are things in this world that defy conventional explanation, things that powerful forces would prefer to keep hidden. To those who would dismiss this as mere fantasy or the ramblings of an overactive imagination, I say this: look closer. Ask questions. The truth is out there, hidden in the shadows of our world. And sometimes those shadows take on forms that challenge everything we think we know about reality. The crisp autumn air bit at my skin as I stepped out onto the porch, my eyes scanning the darkening sky. It was a chilly evening in 1982, and the wind whispered through the trees surrounding our rural home. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me ever since my father had shared a story from his past, a tale that had haunted him for years. I was in my early 20s then, having recently moved back home after a stint in the city. The transition from urban life to our quiet, wooded property had been jarring, but there was something comforting about being back where I grew up. As I stood there, lost in thought, my father joined me on the porch, his weathered hands clutching a steaming mug of coffee. "Thinking about that story again?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, turning to face him. In the fading light, I could see the lines etched deep into his face, each one a testament to the years of hard work and worry he'd endured. But there was something else there too, a shadow that crossed his features whenever he spoke of that night. "Tell me again," I urged, even though I knew every detail by heart. Something about hearing it from him made it feel more real, more immediate. He sighed, taking a long sip of his coffee before setting the mug down on the porch railing. "It was a night much like this one," he began, his eyes growing distant as he cast his mind back. "Your aunt had come down from Toronto to visit. She left around 9 p.m., but her car broke down about 7 miles from here." I listened intently, even though I knew what was coming. The way he told it, I could almost see it happening. My aunt's car sputtering to a stop in front of a family friend's house, the relief on her face when they offered to let her use their phone. "I drove down to pick her up," my father continued. "She decided to stay the night with us and deal with the car in the morning. It was after 10 p.m. by the time we started heading back home." He paused then, his hands gripping the porch railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. I waited, knowing he was steeling himself for what came next. We were driving through that stretch of woods. You know the one about halfway between here and town, when we heard it. A scream like nothing I've ever heard before or since. It was inhuman. Loud enough to drown out the radio, the engine, everything. I shivered, not entirely from the cold. I'd driven that road countless times, but ever since hearing this story, it had taken on a sinister quality in my mind. I slammed on the brakes, my father went on, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Your aunt and I were both freaking out, trying to figure out what the hell we'd just heard. And then, we saw it. He fell silent for a long moment, his eyes focused on something far away. I waited, holding my breath. It was at the edge of the headlights, just off to the side of the road. At first I thought it was a coyote, but it was standing on its hind legs, and it was huge, at least 7 feet tall. Its tail, I'll never forget that tail. Black and white stripes, like something out of a nightmare. I'd heard this description many times, but it never failed to send a chill down my spine. The image it conjured was too bizarre, too wrong to be real, and yet the fear in my father's eyes was all too genuine. It walked across the road in front of the car, he continued. Just calmly walked across on 2 legs, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And then it disappeared into the woods on the other side. That's when we heard the scream again, even louder this time, like it was right next to the car. We got out of there as fast as we could. As he finished his story, we both fell into a contemplative silence. The darkness had fully settled in now. The woods around our house a black void punctuated only by the faint glow of our porch light. You really think it was a skinwalker? I asked, voicing the question that had been on my mind ever since I first heard the tale. My father shrugged, picking up his now cold coffee. I don't know what it was. All I know is what I saw and what I heard, and I hope to God I never see or hear anything like it again. With that, he turned and went back into the house, leaving me alone with my thoughts in the endless darkness of the forest. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image of the creature from my mind. I'd grown up hearing stories of skinwalkers, shape-shifting witches from Navajo legend, but I'd always dismissed them as just that, stories. Now, faced with my father's unwavering belief in what he'd seen, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I found myself growing increasingly obsessed with my father's encounter. I scoured the internet for similar stories, pored over books on cryptozoology and Native American folklore, and even reached out to local historians to see if they'd heard of any similar incidents in the area. My search yielded little concrete information, but it did uncover a pattern of strange sightings and unexplained phenomena in the region stretching back decades. There were reports of unusually large bipedal animals, eerie screams in the night, and an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to permeate certain areas of the forest. One afternoon, while helping my father clear some brush from the edge of our property, I decided to broach the subject again. Dad, I began hesitantly, have you ever thought about going back to that spot? You know, where you saw it? He paused in his work, leaning on his rake as he considered my question. Why would I want to do that? He asked, his tone guarded. I shrugged, trying to appear casual. I don't know, closure maybe, or to see if there's any evidence of something unusual in the area? My father's expression darkened. Listen to me, he said, his voice low and serious. There are some things in this world that we're not meant to understand. Whatever I saw that night, it wasn't natural, and it's best left alone. His words should have discouraged me, but they only fueled my curiosity. That night after my parents had gone to bed, I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I grabbed a flashlight, a camera, and a notebook, and slipped out of the house. The night was cool and clear, a full moon casting an eerie glow over the landscape. As I drove towards the spot where my father had his encounter, my heart pounded in my chest, a mix of excitement and fear coursing through my veins. The stretch of road where it happened was unremarkable in the daylight, just another wooded section of highway. But at night, it took on a different character. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Every shadow held the potential for something other. I parked my car on the shoulder and stepped out, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. For hours I wandered the area, searching for, I wasn't even sure what. Unusual tracks, tufts of fur, anything that might corroborate my father's story. But the forest kept its secrets close. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, I reluctantly headed back to my car. I was tired, cold, and no closer to answers than when I'd started. But as I reached for the door handle, a sound froze me in place. A scream. Distant but unmistakable. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not quite animal, not quite human, but something in between. The sound seemed to go on forever, rising and falling in pitch, until it suddenly cut off. I stood there, my heart racing, straining my ears for any further noise. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the forest. With shaking hands, I got into my car and drove home, my mind reeling. I had heard it, the same sound my father had described. It was real. From that night on, my obsession grew. I began spending more and more time in the woods, always under the guise of hiking or nature photography. I set up trail cameras, collected soil samples, and interviewed locals about any strange experiences they might have had. My parents grew concerned about my newfound fascination with the forest. They couldn't understand why I was suddenly spending so much time outdoors, often returning home late at night, muddy and exhausted. "You need to be careful out there," my mother warned one evening as I was preparing to head out again. "The woods can be dangerous, especially at night." If only she knew the half of it. As the months passed, I began to notice subtle changes in the forest. Areas that had once been teeming with wildlife now stood eerily silent. I found strange markings on trees, deep gouges that couldn't have been made by any normal animal. And always, there was that feeling of being watched, of something just beyond the edge of my vision. It was on a crisp autumn evening, almost exactly a year after my first nighttime excursion, that everything changed. I was deep in the woods, farther than I'd ever ventured before. The sun had set hours ago, and I was relying on my flashlight and the faint glow of the moon to navigate. As I picked my way through a particularly dense patch of underbrush, my foot caught on something, sending me sprawling to the ground. Cursing under my breath, I turned to see what had tripped me. What I saw made my blood run cold. Half buried in the leaf litter was a bone, a large bone, too large to belong to any animal native to these woods. With trembling hands, I brushed away the leaves, revealing more bones, a rib cage, a pelvis, a skull. The skull was the most disturbing part. It was clearly animal in origin, but wrong somehow. The eye sockets were too large, the jaw too elongated, and the teeth, row upon row of sharp, serrated teeth, more like a shark's than any land animal I'd ever seen. As I crouched there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, at the edge of the light, stood a figure. For a moment, my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was tall, easily 7 feet or more, and covered in a patchwork of fur and what looked like scales. Its legs were bent backward like a dog's hind legs, ending in massive clawed feet. But it was the face that truly horrified me. It was a twisted amalgamation of coyote and human features. The snout was elongated, filled with teeth that gleamed in the flashlight's beam. But the eyes were disturbingly human, filled with an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. Then, slowly, deliberately, its mouth opened. What came out was the same scream I had heard a year ago, that unearthly howl that was neither human nor animal. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or safety. Behind me, I could hear it giving chase, its footfalls shaking the very ground. I don't know how long I ran, or how I found my way back to my car. All I know is that somehow, I made it. As I sped away, my headlights caught a glimpse of something standing at the edge of the road, a tall, impossible figure that seemed to shimmer and shift in the darkness. When I finally made it home, I was a mess, covered in cuts and bruises, my clothes torn and muddy. My parents were frantic, demanding to know what had happened. But how could I explain? How could I tell them that the monster from Dad's story was real, and that I had seen it with my own eyes? In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination, a product of too many sleepless nights and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I had seen was real as the bone-chilling scream that now haunted my dreams. I never went back into those woods. But sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that scream again, drifting on the breeze. A reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. As the years passed, I tried to put that night behind me. I moved away, started a family, built a life far from those dark woods. But the memory never faded. It lingered, always there in the back of my mind, coloring how I saw the world. I became a writer, channeling my experiences into fiction, stories of the unknown and the unexplainable. My readers praised my vivid imagination, never knowing that my most terrifying tales were rooted in truth. It wasn't until my own child was born that I truly understood my father's reluctance to speak about what he'd seen. As I held my newborn, I realized that there are some truths too heavy, too dangerous to pass on. Some mysteries that are better left unsolved. But still, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking back to those woods, to the creature I saw, to the scream that still echoes in my nightmares. And I wonder, what else is out there, lurking in the shadows just beyond the edge of what we know? I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Not my wife, not my friends, not even my own child. But sometimes when I look into the darkness at the edge of our property, I catch myself listening, waiting. For what, I'm not sure. Maybe one day when my child is older, I'll find the courage to share my story, to pass on the knowledge that the world is stranger and more terrifying than we can imagine. But for now, I keep my secret, and I watch the shadows, always aware that something might be watching back. And so, life goes on. I wake each morning, go about my day and try to forget. But in the quiet moments when the world grows still and the shadows deepen, I remember. I remember the creature in the woods, the impossible skull half buried in the leaves, and the scream that shattered the night. I remember, and I wonder, what if it remembers me too? It started the same way it always does. A quiet knock on the door of the sheriff's office. Nothing too loud, nothing alarming, just enough to let me know someone needed to talk. It was 1983, and in the small secluded town of Winters Hollow, Pennsylvania, it was rare to have a real emergency. We had our share of thefts, rowdy behavior down at Henson's bar, but nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that would require the skill set of a detective who had once worked homicide in Philadelphia. That was until now. I opened the door and found Mrs. Carolyn Peake standing there, wringing her hands. Carolyn, in her late 40s, was the type of woman who never caused trouble. She lived quietly with her husband on their farm just outside of town, raising chickens and minding their business. She wouldn't have come to me unless something was seriously wrong. Her face told me everything before she even opened her mouth. "Sheriff, it's Charlie, he's gone." Charlie Peake, her husband, had been a well-known figure around town. Always jovial, always reliable. I leaned against the doorframe and sighed, already feeling that familiar tug of something darker lurking beneath the surface. "When did you last see him, Carolyn?" "Last night, just before bed. He said he was going out to check on the barn. He never came back." My gut told me this wasn't just some guy getting lost in the woods. Winters Hollow was the type of place where you knew every trail, every turn. Charlie was no stranger to these woods either. He had been raised here, knew them like the back of his hand. "All right," I said, grabbing my hat and heading out with her. I figured it'd be another case of a man stumbling drunk through the woods, or maybe falling and twisting an ankle. But the cold knot in my stomach told me otherwise. We arrived at the Peak Farm just as the sun was starting to dip. The trees around their property cast long shadows, the kind that makes everything look sinister. The barn door was open, the light inside flickering as if someone had left in a hurry. I stepped inside and took in the scene. The tools were scattered. Hay was thrown about like there'd been some kind of struggle, but no sign of Charlie. "Where was he when you saw him last?" I asked, looking around for any clue that might hint at what happened. "He was in here by the stall checking on the cows." I stepped closer to the stall, and that's when I saw it. A streak of dark red smeared across the wall. Carolyn gasped behind me, but I knelt down studying it. The blood wasn't just splattered. It was dragged like someone had been pulled. "Carolyn, get back to the house," I ordered, pulling my flashlight from my belt. She didn't argue, just turned and walked quickly back toward the front porch. I kept my eyes on the blood trail that led outside, toward the woods. It wasn't like any animal attack I'd seen before, too deliberate. Animals don't drag their prey like that, not unless they're taking them somewhere specific. And Charlie wasn't the type to be caught off guard by a bear or some other wild creature. No, this was something else. I followed the trail deep into the woods. The air grew colder and the trees thicker, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. But there was a feeling, like being watched, something primal crawling up the back of my neck. It wasn't just fear, it was something worse, something that didn't belong in these woods. I kept going, my hand on the grip of my revolver, until I found the clearing. And there, lying on the ground, was what was left of Charlie Peak. His body was twisted in a way no man's body should be, his face frozen in a scream. His chest had been torn open, ribs cracked, and the skin peeled back. Blood soaked the earth around him. But it wasn't the body that shook me. It was the thing standing over it. At first I thought it was a man. Tall, gaunt, and pale, its eyes reflecting the light of my flashlight like an animal's. But no man had legs like that. Long, spindly things bent backwards, making it look like a spider as it crouched. Its face, though, was the worst. Hollowed-out eyes, skin pulled so tight you could see every bone underneath. It stared at me unblinking and then smiled, revealing rows of teeth too sharp, too jagged. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at it while it stared at me. Then it turned, its long limbs carrying it effortlessly into the woods, vanishing into the darkness. I barely registered the sound of Carolyn's voice calling my name in the distance. I holstered my gun and ran back toward the farm, telling myself not to look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it was gone. The coroner didn't know what to make of Charlie's body. There wasn't enough left to get any real answers, and the story I gave wasn't enough to explain it either. I said it was an animal attack. There wasn't anything else I could say without sounding insane. But the people in town, they knew better. Winters Hollow was a small place, and people talked. They whispered about the old legends, about the stories their grandparents used to tell them about creatures in the woods. I'd heard them too, but I never believed them. Not until now. The town was quiet for a few weeks after that. No one went out after dark, and no one came to me with missing person reports. But I knew it wasn't over. That thing, it wasn't going to stop, not after just one kill. And then, a few days later, the reports started coming in again. Another missing farmer, then another. They found the bodies, or what was left of them, in the same way, ripped apart, dragged into the woods. But I didn't tell anyone what I knew. How could I? They'd lock me up, throw me in some padded room and call it delusion. I couldn't stop it, but I could try to keep people away, try to warn them without telling them the truth. But deep down, I knew it was pointless. That thing in the woods wasn't just hunting for sport. It was hunting because it was hungry, and it was going to keep coming back. I left Winters Hollow not long after that, moved across the state to some small town where no one knew my name, where I could forget about what I'd seen. But there are nights when I still hear that soft knock on my door. There are nights when I know, deep in my bones, that it's found me again. As the days passed, the weight of what I'd seen in those woods pressed down on me like a physical thing. I tried to go about my duties as sheriff to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it was a losing battle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature's face, its inhuman smile, those rows of jagged teeth. The townspeople noticed the change in me. How could they not? I was jumpy, irritable, my eyes constantly darting to the shadows as if expecting that thing to leap out at any moment. Some folks attributed it to the stress of Charlie's death, others to the mounting pressure of the unsolved disappearances. If only they knew the truth. I started drinking more heavily than I ever had before. It was the only way I could get any sleep at night. But even in my alcohol-induced haze, the nightmares found me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my sheets tangled around me, the echo of that creature's inhuman screech ringing in my ears. As the body count rose, so did the tension in Winters Hollow. People were scared, and they looked to me for answers, for protection. But how could I protect them from something I could barely comprehend myself? I increased patrols, enforced a strict curfew, but deep down I knew it was all for show. If that thing wanted to hunt, no amount of manpower or firepower was going to stop it. I started doing my own research, digging into the town's history, looking for any mention of similar occurrences in the past. What I found chilled me to the bone. Every few decades there were reports of strange disappearances, bodies found mutilated in the woods. The details were always vague, often dismissed as animal attacks or the work of some deranged killer passing through. But I knew better now. This thing, whatever it was, had been here for a long time. One night, about a month after Charlie's death, I was sitting in my office, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on my desk, when I heard a commotion outside. I grabbed my gun and rushed out to find a crowd gathered in the town square. At the center was Old Man Johnson, the town's resident conspiracy theorist. He was waving a weathered book above his head, his eyes wild with a mixture of fear and excitement. "I told you," he was shouting. "I told you all. It's the Wendigo. It's come back to hunt us again." I pushed through the crowd, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about, Johnson?" I demanded. He thrust the book at me. It was an old journal, its pages yellow with age. "It's all in here, Sheriff. My great-grandfather's journal. He wrote about it, about the creature that hunts in these woods. The Wendigo, a spirit of hunger that possesses men and turns them into monsters. It comes every few generations when the winters are harsh and food is scarce." I flipped through the journal, my blood running cold as I read descriptions that matched all too closely with what I had seen in the woods. The gaunt figure, the backward-bending legs, the insatiable hunger for human flesh. It was all there, written down decades ago. The crowd was getting restless, fear and anger mixing in equal measure. Some were calling for a hunting party to go into the woods and kill the beast. Others wanted to abandon the town altogether. I knew I had to regain control of the situation before things spiraled out of hand. "Everyone, calm down," I shouted, my voice cutting through the noise. "We don't know what we're dealing with here. Until we do, I want everyone to stay in their homes after dark. No exceptions. We'll increase patrols and—" My words were cut off by a blood-curdling scream from the edge of town. Everyone froze, their eyes wide with terror. Then chaos erupted. People started running in all directions, panic taking hold. I drew my gun and ran towards the source of the scream, praying I wasn't too late. As I rounded the corner, I saw it. The creature was standing over the body of a young woman, its claws dripping with fresh blood. It turned to look at me, and I swear I saw recognition in those hollow eyes. It remembered me from our encounter in the woods. I raised my gun, my hands shaking so badly I could barely aim. "Stop right there!" I shouted, knowing how futile my words were. The creature tilted its head almost curiously, and then it smiled that terrible smile. In a flash it was gone, disappearing into the shadows with inhuman speed. I ran to the woman, but it was too late. She was gone, her body torn open just like Charlie's had been. The next few days were a blur of activity. The National Guard was called in. The woods were combed inch by inch, but they found nothing. No tracks, no layers, no sign of the creature. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. The official story was that a large, unidentified predator was responsible for the attacks. Mountain lion, maybe, or a bear driven to desperation by a harsh winter. But the people of Winters Hollow knew better. They had seen the truth in my eyes, had heard the tremor in my voice when I tried to explain away the inexplicable. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the attacks slowly stopped. Life in Winters Hollow began to return to normal, or at least a new version of normal. People still jumped at shadows, still hurried home before dark, but the immediate terror began to fade. But not for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that the creature was out there, waiting, biding its time until hunger drove it to hunt again. I became obsessed with finding a way to stop it, to protect the town when it inevitably returned. I pored over every book, every legend I could find about the Wendigo. I spoke to Native American elders, to cryptozoologists, to anyone who might have even a shred of useful information. Most thought I was crazy, but I didn't care. I knew what I had seen, what I had to prepare for. As the years passed, I watched the town slowly forget. New generations grew up hearing the stories as just that, stories. The events of that terrible year became local legend, a tale to scare children around campfires. But I never forgot. I couldn't. I'm an old man now, my days as sheriff long behind me. But I still keep watch. Every winter when the nights grow long and the wind howls through the trees, I listen for that soft knock at my door. I keep my gun close, loaded with silver bullets blessed by every holy man I could find. I don't know if they'll work, but it's something. And so I wait, caught between the hope that it's truly gone and the dread of its return. Because deep down, I know the truth. In the dark woods of Winters Hollow, hunger never truly dies. It only sleeps, waiting for the right moment to awaken once more. As I sit here penning these words, I can't help but wonder if I'm doing the right thing by sharing this story. Part of me hopes that by putting it out there, I might find others who have encountered this creature, who might have knowledge that could help defeat it. But another part of me fears that I'm only spreading the terror, planting seeds of fear in the minds of those who read this. But I've carried this burden alone for too long. The weight of it has bent my back and whitened my hair. If I don't share what I know, if I don't warn others, then what was it all for? What purpose did my survival serve? I've come to believe that the Wendigo isn't just a creature of flesh and blood. It's something more, something that exists on the border between our world and another. It's a manifestation of hunger, of greed, of the darkest parts of human nature. And as long as those things exist in us, it will always have a way back into our world. There are nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that I can hear the sound of those backwards bending legs stalking through the woods outside my window. On those nights I sit in my chair, my old service revolver in my lap, and I wait for dawn. Because I know that as long as I'm alive, as long as I remember, I'm standing guard not just for myself, but for all those who have forgotten or never knew the danger that lurks in the shadows. To those who read this and dismiss it as the ramblings of a senile old man, I envy you. I envy your ability to sleep soundly at night, to walk in the woods without constantly looking over your shoulder. But to those who read this and feel a chill of recognition, to those who have seen things in the darkness that defy explanation, I say this: you are not alone. The world is stranger and more terrifying than most people are willing to admit. But knowledge is power, and in knowledge lies our only hope of survival. So I'll keep watching, keep waiting. And if the day comes when that soft knock sounds at my door once more, I'll be ready. Because someone has to stand against the darkness. Someone has to remember, and for better or worse, that someone is me. As I sit here, the weight of years pressing down on my shoulders, I can't help but reflect on how this knowledge, this burden, has shaped my life. Every decision, every relationship, every moment has been colored by what I saw in those woods all those years ago. I never married, never had children. How could I? The thought of bringing innocence into a world where such horrors exist was more than I could bear. And how could I ever explain to a wife why I woke up screaming in the night, why I insisted on keeping silver bullets in the house, why I could never truly relax? My few friends have drifted away over the years, put off by my obsession, by the haunted look in my eyes that never quite goes away. I don't blame them. It's not easy being close to someone who lives with one foot in a nightmare. But I'm not completely alone. Over the years, I've connected with others who have had similar experiences. We're a scattered bunch, linked by little more than our shared trauma and our determination to stand guard against the darkness. We exchange letters, share information, support each other as best we can. It's not much, but it's something. One of these connections led me to an elderly Algonquin woman living on a reservation in northern Quebec. She had heard stories of the Wendigo passed down through generations of her people. According to her, the creature isn't just a physical being, but a spirit that can possess humans who have given in to greed or desperation. She told me of ancient rituals used to ward off the Wendigo, of protective symbols and sacred herbs. I don't know if I believe in their power, but I've incorporated them into my defenses anyway. At this point, I'll take any edge I can get. Another correspondent, a folklorist from the University of Chicago, has been studying similar legends from around the world. She believes that the Wendigo might be part of a larger class of entities, hunger spirits that have been reported in various cultures throughout history. Her theory is that these creatures feed not just on flesh, but on fear and despair as well. The idea haunts me. Could the terror I've lived with all these years have been sustaining the very thing I fear? Is my vigilance somehow keeping it alive? These are the thoughts that plague me in the dark hours of the night when sleep eludes me. I've tried to move on, to build a life outside of this obsession. I took up woodworking, thinking the focus and precision required might give my mind some peace. For a while, it helped. The feel of the wood beneath my hands, the satisfaction of creating something tangible and harmless, provided a much-needed respite from the horrors that haunted my thoughts. But even in this, I couldn't escape. I found myself carving protective symbols into everything I made, hiding silver shavings in the joints of furniture, inscribing warnings in dead languages on the undersides of tables and chairs. My creations became extensions of my paranoia, physical manifestations of my fear. I've traveled too, thinking that perhaps distance might dull the memories. I've stood on the shores of the Pacific, feeling insignificant before its vastness. I've walked the crowded streets of New York, surrounded by millions of people who have no idea of the terrors that lurk in the dark corners of the world. I've even ventured as far as the mountains of Tibet, seeking wisdom from monks who claim to have battled demons. But no matter where I go, the shadows seem to follow. In the misty forests of the Pacific Northwest, I see shapes moving just at the edge of my vision. In the concrete canyons of Manhattan, I hear echoes of inhuman howls in the wind that whips between the skyscrapers. And in the stark, snow-covered peaks of the Himalayas, I feel watched by something ancient and hungry. Always, I return to Winter's Hollow. This place, for better or worse, is where my story began and where, I suspect, it will end. The town has changed over the years. New buildings have sprung up, old ones have been torn down. The faces on the streets are different now, younger, unburdened by the memories that weigh so heavily on me. But the woods remain. They stand silent and dark at the edge of town, a constant reminder of what lurks within. Sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear whispers coming from those trees, calling me, taunting me. I've considered burning them down more than once. In my darkest moments, I've fantasized about watching those ancient pines go up in flames, imagining the creature's lair being consumed by fire. But I know it wouldn't make a difference. You can't kill a spirit with fire, and besides, who's to say it's even in there anymore? For all I know, it could be anywhere. It could be everywhere. There are times when I question my own sanity. Could it all have been a delusion? A hallucination brought on by stress and fear? But then I look at the scars on my body, souvenirs from encounters I've had over the years, and I know the truth. This is real, all of it, no matter how much I might wish otherwise. I've tried to warn the new generation, to make them understand the danger that surrounds them. But they look at me with pity in their eyes, seeing only a crazy old man spinning tales. Even those who remember that terrible year so long ago have convinced themselves it was nothing more than a series of animal attacks, a brief period of madness that the town has long since recovered from. Only a few listen. A small group of teens, outcasts, and misfits mostly, have taken an interest in my stories. They come to my house sometimes, asking questions, listening with wide eyes as I recount my experiences. Part of me wants to send them away, to protect them from this knowledge. But another part knows that someone needs to carry on this vigil when I'm gone. I've started teaching them what I know, how to recognize the signs of the Wendigo's presence, how to protect themselves, how to fight back if it comes to that. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, if I'm protecting them or damning them to a life of fear and paranoia like mine. But I have to try. I have to believe that knowledge, no matter how terrifying, is better than ignorance. As I write these words, the sun is setting outside my window. The shadows are growing longer, reaching out like grasping fingers. Soon, night will fall, and with it comes that familiar dread. I'll check my defenses, load my gun, and settle in for another long night of watching and waiting. Because that's what I do now. I'm not just a survivor anymore, not just a witness. I'm a guardian, standing on the edge between light and darkness, between the world of man and the realm of monsters. It's a lonely post, a thankless job, but someone has to do it. And so I wait, my eyes on the darkness, my ears straining for that soft knock at the door. Because I know that one day it will come again, and when it does, I'll be ready. The years have taken their toll on me. My hands shake now, making it harder to aim my gun or carve my protective symbols. My eyesight isn't what it used to be, and sometimes I find myself squinting at the shadows, unsure if what I'm seeing is a threat or just a trick of the light. But my mind remains sharp, honed by decades of vigilance and fear. I've started to wonder what will happen when I'm gone. Who will stand guard then? Will all of this knowledge, all of this preparation die with me? The thought terrifies me almost as much as the creature itself. That's why I've started writing everything down. Every encounter, every theory, every scrap of lore I've collected over the years. I'm compiling it all into a journal, a guidebook for those who might come after me. It's my legacy, my attempt to ensure that even if I fall, the fight will continue. There are days when the weight of it all becomes almost too much to bear. Days when I consider ending it all, taking my secrets to the grave and finding some measure of peace. But I can't. The thought of leaving this world unprotected, of abandoning my post, is unthinkable. So I persevere. I wake each morning, check my traps and wards, and face another day knowing that at any moment the horror could return. It's a heavy burden, but it's mine to carry. As I sit here, watching the sun sink below the horizon, I find myself reflecting on the nature of fear. It's a curious thing, fear. It can paralyze you, yes, but it can also drive you to incredible feats of courage and endurance. In many ways, fear has been my constant companion these past decades, more faithful than any friend or lover. I've come to understand that the Wendigo, in all its terrifying glory, is perhaps the purest embodiment of fear itself. It's the fear of the unknown, of the wild places where civilization's light doesn't reach. It's the fear of our own darker natures, of the hunger and greed that lurk within all of us. But I've also learned that fear can be faced, can be overcome. Each day that I continue this vigil, each night that I stand my ground against the darkness, I'm proving that. I may be afraid, but I'm not defeated. Not yet. And so, as another night falls over Winter's Hollow, I take my place by the window, my old bones creaking in protest as I settle into my chair. My gun is loaded, my wards are set, and my will is iron. Let the Wendigo come if it dares. This old man still has some fight left in him. To whoever reads this, know that the world is darker and more dangerous than you can imagine. But know also that there are those who stand against that darkness, who fight to keep it at bay. We are few, we are scattered, but we are strong. And if one day you find yourself face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something hungry and ancient and terrifying, remember this: you are not alone. There are others out there who have faced the same horrors and lived to tell the tale. Find us. Join us. Because in the end, it's not just about survival. It's about standing up to the darkness, about refusing to let fear rule our lives. As for me, my watch continues. In the quiet of the night, in the shadows of the forest, I remain vigilant, because someone has to, because the alternative is unthinkable, because even in the face of unspeakable horror, hope survives. And who knows? Maybe one day we'll win this fight. Maybe one day the Wendigo and all its kind will be nothing more than stories told around campfires. Until then, we watch, we wait, we stand ready. For in the heart of Winter's Hollow, in the depths of the night, hunger stirs. And we are all that stands between it and the world.